This morning occurred another of those shocking murders which have become the almost daily food of the newspapers, the direct result of the socialistic doctrines and women's rights agitations, which have made every woman the avenger of her own wrongs, and all society the hunting ground for her victims. About 9 o'clock a lady deliberately shot a man dead in the public parlor of the Southern Hotel, coolly remarking, as she threw down her revolver and permitted herself to be taken into custody, "He brought it on himself." Our reporters were immediately dispatched to the scene of the tragedy, and gathered the following particulars. Yesterday afternoon arrived at the hotel from Washington, Colonel George Selby and family, who had taken passage and were to sail at noon today in the steamer Scotia for England. The colonel was a handsome man about 40, a gentleman of wealth and high social position, a resident of New Orleans. He served with distinction in the Confederate Army, and received a wound in the leg from which he has never entirely recovered, being obliged to use a cane in locomotion. This morning at about 9 o'clock, a lady, accompanied by a gentleman, called at the office of the hotel and asked for Colonel Selby. The colonel was at breakfast. Would the clerk tell him that a lady and gentleman wished to see him for a moment in the parlor? The clerk says that the gentleman asked her, "What do you want to see him for?" and that she replied, "He is going to Europe, and I ought to just say goodbye." Colonel Selby was informed, and the lady and gentleman were shown to the parlor, in which were at the time 3 or 4 other persons. 5 minutes after 2 shots were fired in quick succession, and there was a rush to the parlor from which the reports came. Colonel Selby was found lying on the floor, bleeding, but not dead. 2 gentlemen, who had just come in, had seized the lady, who made no resistance, and she was at once given in charge of a police officer who arrived. The persons who were in the parlor agree substantially as to what occurred. They had happened to be looking towards the door when the man, Colonel Selby, entered with his cane, and they looked at him, because he stopped as if surprised and frightened, and made a backward movement. At the same moment the lady in the bonnet advanced towards him and said something like, "George, will you go with me?" He replied, throwing up his hand and retreating, "My God, I can't, don't fire," and the next instant 2 shots were heard and he fell. The lady appeared to be beside herself with rage or excitement, and trembled very much when the gentleman took hold of her. It was to them she said, "He brought it on himself." Colonel Selby was carried at once to his room and Dr. Puffer, the eminent surgeon, was sent for. It was found that he was shot through the breast and through the abdomen. Other aid was summoned, but the wounds were mortal, and Colonel Selby expired in an hour, in pain, but his mind was clear to the last and he made a full deposition. The substance of it was that his murderess is a Miss Laura Hawkins, whom he had known at Washington as a lobbyist and had some business with her. She had followed him with her attentions and solicitations, and had endeavored to make him desert his wife and go to Europe with her. When he resisted and avoided her, she had threatened him. Only the day before he left Washington she had declared that he should never go out of the city alive without her. It seems to have been a deliberate and premeditated murder, the woman following him to Washington on purpose to commit it. We learn that the murderess, who is a woman of dazzling and transcendent beauty and about 26 or 7, is a niece of Senator Dilworthy at whose house she has been spending the winter. She belongs to a high Southern family, and has the reputation of being an heiress. Like some other great beauties and belles in Washington, however, there have been whispers that she had something to do with the lobby. If we mistake not, we have heard her name mentioned in connection with the sale of the Tennessee lands to the Knobs University, the bill for which passed the House last night. Her companion is Mr. Harry Brearley, a New York dandy, who has been in Washington. His connection with her and with this tragedy is not known, but he was also taken into custody, and will be detained at least as a witness. P.S. One of the persons present in the parlor says that after Laura Hawkins had fired twice, she turned the pistol towards herself, but that Brearley sprung and caught it from her hand, and that it was he who threw it on the floor. Further particulars with full biographies of all the parties in our next edition. Philip hastened at once to the Southern Hotel, where he found still a great state of excitement, and 1,000 different and exaggerated stories passing from mouth to mouth. The witnesses of the event had told it over so many times that they had worked it up into a most dramatic scene, and embellished it with whatever could heighten its awfulness. Outsiders had taken up invention also. The colonel's wife had gone insane, they said. The children had rushed into the parlor and rolled themselves in their father's blood. The hotel clerk said that he noticed there was murder in the woman's eye when he saw her. A person who had met the woman on the stairs felt a creeping sensation. Some thought Brearley was an accomplice, and that he had set the woman on to kill his rival. Some said the woman showed the calmness and indifference of insanity. P422.jpg, 38K. Philip learned that Harry and Laura had both been taken to the city prison, and he went there, but he was not admitted. Not being a newspaper reporter, he could not see either of them that night, but the officer questioned him suspiciously and asked him who he was. He might perhaps see Brearley in the morning. The latest editions of the evening papers had the result of the inquest. It was a plain enough case for the jury, but they sat over it a long time, listening to the wrangling of the physicians. Dr. Puffer insisted that the man died from the effects of the wound in the chest. Dr. Dobbs strongly insisted that the wound in the abdomen caused death. Dr. Golightly suggested that in his opinion death ensued from a complication of the two wounds and perhaps other causes. He examined the table waiter, as to whether Colonel Selby ate any breakfast, and what he ate, and if he had any appetite. P423.jpg, 30K. The jury finally threw themselves back upon the indisputable fact that Selby was dead, that either wound would have killed him, admitted by the doctors, and rendered a verdict that he died from pistol-shot wounds inflicted by a pistol in the hands of Laura Hawkins. The morning papers blazed with big type, and overflowed with details of the murder. The accounts in the evening papers were only the premonitory drops to this mighty shower. The scene was dramatically worked up in column after column. There were sketches, biographical and historical. There were long specials from Washington, giving a full history of Laura's career there, with the names of men with whom she was said to be intimate, a description of Senator Dilworthy's residence and of his family, and of Laura's room in his house, and a sketch of the senator's appearance and what he said. There was a great deal about her beauty, her accomplishments, and her brilliant position in society, and her doubtful position in society. There was also an interview with Colonel Sellers and another with Washington Hawkins, the brother of the murderess. One journal had a long dispatch from Hawkeye, reporting the excitement in that quiet village and the reception of the awful intelligence. All the parties had been interviewed. There were reports of conversations with the clerk at the hotel, with the callboy, with the waiter at table, with all the witnesses, with the policeman, with the landlord, who wanted it understood that nothing of that sort had ever happened in his house before, although it had always been frequented by the best Southern society, and with Mrs. Colonel Selby. There were diagrams illustrating the scene of the shooting, and views of the hotel and street, and portraits of the parties. P424.jpg, 30K. There were 3-minute and different statements from the doctors about the wounds, so technically worded that nobody could understand them. Harry and Laura had also been interviewed, and there was a statement from Philip himself, which a reporter had knocked him up out of bed at midnight to give, though how he found him, Philip never could conjecture. What some of the journals lacked in suitable length for the occasion, they made up in encyclopedic information about other similar murders and shootings. The statement from Laura was not full, in fact it was fragmentary, and consisted of 9 parts of the reporter's valuable observations to one of Laura's, and it was, as the reporter significantly remarked, incoherent, but it appeared that Laura claimed to be Selby's wife, or to have been his wife, that he had deserted her and betrayed her, and that she was going to follow him to Europe. When the reporter asked, "What made you shoot him, Miss Hawkins?" Laura's only reply was, very simply, "Did I shoot him? Do they say I shot him? and she would say no more. The news of the murder was made the excitement of the day. Talk of it filled the town. The facts reported were scrutinized, the standing of the parties was discussed, the dozen different theories of the motive, broached in the newspapers, were disputed over. During the night, subtle electricity had carried the tale over all the wires of the continent and under the sea, and in all villages and towns of the Union, from the Atlantic to the Territories, and away up and down the Pacific slope, and as far as London and Paris and Berlin. That morning the name of Laura Hawkins was spoken by millions and millions of people, while the owner of it, the sweet child of years ago, the beautiful Queen of Washington drawing rooms, sat shivering on her cotbed in the darkness of a damp cell in the Tombs.